I was reading E. E. Cummings at 17 too, so this excerpt comes from a poem in a very different mood about a northern New England snowfall in the Cummings manner, which I'm sure you'll recognize. White earth lay dreaming of soft somethings asking something, but it was impossible to know what. Perhaps asking the trees too, dreaming of soft somethings, looking in the window of an old brook, nobody home. The erotic poetry of E. E. Cummings provided the perfect conduit for my teenage libido, and passages like this one about a shared sexual encounter, even though in life I'd experienced no such thing. How can we be this turned inside out, fiercely, a soft, somehow, bubble? Another change of tone. I was a child of World War II and the Korean War, so casualties in the battlefield were very much on my mind, as you see in the opening of this somewhat melodramatic poem about a beggar, man that nobody dares to look at, sitting on the earth ashamed, with one leg resting on the hard, cold cement, the other resting on a battlefield somewhere, rotting. But if you check this note at the bottom of the page, addressed to an English teacher I first showed it to, you can see there was another influence, namely Bertolt Brecht in his play Threepenny Opera, which is to say I was doing in these poems what young writers do, that is, trying out a variety of writing styles, not yet ready to assimilate them into a style of my own, and trying out people as subjects too. And here we go on to the farm woman, who has, to quote the first long line you see there, a time-welted face bandaged by a dirty kerchief. Or clicking along here, just two more left, the rejected black man in this next poem, which explores still another style, that is, a spoken vernacular language, maybe derived from Sandburg and William Carlos Williams, two favorite poets at the time, now two as a matter of fact. There's a guy that sells sweet cider in there, a nice old guy. He used to play his guitar when it was summer, and skipping a couple of lines, he told us stories and winked and laughed teeth across his wrinkly black face when we wanted to hear another one, down to the last two lines set apart. I used to like him when I was little, but then Pa told me to stay away from that place. The twist at the end of that poem is not particularly expert, as you see, but it does show my interest at age 17 in how racism is passed down through generations. By the way, the sympathy toward the black man has nothing to do with the civil rights movement, since this was the 1950s, several years earlier than the advent of Martin Luther King. So, and this is a discovery I made rereading the poems for this presentation. It probably dates back to my childhood with those black dolls I mentioned and Little Brown Cocoa. Okay, this last entry from the manuscript in one more poetic style. It's a poem about darkness coming on and departing the next day. I'll read the whole thing for a change. Tall, clumsy dark, stumbling over the buildings and falling into the road and getting up, brushing off his big black coat, arguing with the street lamps, he cursing in hard syllables of black and shouting night. He walking along the street and forgetting evening in the alleys and remembering it, coming back for it in the morning. I distinctly remember thinking about nightfall in the nearby town of Claremont, New Hampshire when I wrote this poem, but there's surely a touch of T.S. Eliot in it too. I'm thinking of that passage you might recall from the opening of Eliot's well-known poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, a particular favorite of mine then, about the yellow fog that comes at evening and slides along the streets and alleyways. But you might be wondering at this point, how did a 17-year-old kid in the sticks of West Claremont, New Hampshire, manage to be so well read in the modernist literature being written by T.S. Eliot and the rest? The answer to that question is that I met a literature student from Columbia University named John Hewitt when I was working at a summer job at Lost River Gorge, a tourist location, as you know, in the White Mountains. And after John got back from Columbia, he sent to my mailbox in the rural boondocks well north of New York City a wonderful box of books. I think of it as my vocation in a box, containing all the authors I've mentioned and more, and giving me a sense of the modernist tradition that I might otherwise have taken years to acquire. And to top it off, he included in the box a copy of the Columbia Literary Magazine with one of his poems in it. suggesting the idea that I might one day be able to publish my own poems too. So wherever you may be today, John Hewitt, thank you for this little Cinderella episode in my formative life as a writer. But I want to leave T.S. Eliot on the screen for a little longer because in the end he turned out to be my great roadblock as a poet. As you know, he wrote a poetry of surface difficulty that borrowed from classical mythology and literary history. And when I got to college and then went on for my master's degree, I discovered he and his new critic followers dominated the literary scene. All my professors talked about was these poets, and this was very discouraging to me because I couldn't find my avenue as a poet through T.S. Eliot. I didn't really know what kind of poetry I wanted to write. All I knew was that I didn't want to write like Eliot, and I didn't want to go on imitating the other poets I'd been reading either. What I decided to do in the end was to quit poetry entirely and become a short story writer. That's why there are so many short story manuscripts in my collection, all written in the period right after college. These are a few of them. Believe it or not, I also wanted to become a cartoonist. Some of my single panel cartoons have no captions, like this one. I'll give you a minute with it. It'll help if you've ever played Monopoly. And now I'll go to a short series of cartoons with captions, which are a little hard to read in the original versions, but then the captions are more than 4 decades old, so I'll read them for you. The politician at the lectern is saying to the crowd, what is needed is a candidate who is free of special interest politics and party manipulation. And then you notice there's a very large hand coming up from behind the lectern into the speaker's jacket. Some of the cartoons were about art, a natural theme, I suppose, for a person who wanted to be an artist. And so this drawing of 2 women examining a canvas that has nothing at all on it, with the caption, he seems to have a way of letting you know what he means without really telling you. Here's a different subject from a series I did about cavemen and cavewomen. Maybe you should ask yourself whether it is making you grow as a person. There has to be some autobiography in this cartoon because when I drew it at age 23, I was suddenly and irrevocably overwhelmed by the responsibilities of family life. I had just gotten married, and in the process, I'd inherited 2 stepchildren. Furthermore, my wife Diane and I had 1 child on the way, and I was looking for a teaching job to support us all. So there's Diane in the cave with our newborn, and here I am about to meet the world with my spear. Another cartoon from the period shows Superman at a bar. Truth, justice, and the American way seemed so right for a while, and then I began to ask myself, was I really happy? Probably this cartoon, too, came out of the conflict I was starting to feel between the great dreams I once had for myself and my life of work and family in the real world. To put it another way, Superman's secret identity in this cartoon was me. Like my short stories, my cartoons never got published in the magazines I sent them to, as these rejection slips from the period show, some for my stories, some for the cartoons. But one time I did get a personal response for a submission of cartoons to the New Yorker. Here it is on a rejection slip in ballpoint ink written by a human hand. Sorry.